Well, I try to forget your generation. I use it in a way I see. But it must justify me. Your generation comes to me.
It occurred to me recently, actually for a while now, that Generation X, my generation, is suddenly the coolest. This is a surprise, because when I was younger, it seemed that we will never be as cool as our parents' generation, the so-called baby boomers. It looked like history has passed us by, and the baton of cool would be passed right down to the millennials, the next generation. But nowadays, both the boomers and the millennials have become extremely uncool, and it is left to us to fight against this global warming and keep things chill. In this video, we will try to figure out why this happened, and how is it that 40 is suddenly the new 20, whereas 20 is the new 80. Let's define the generations. The baby boomers are the generation that was born in the years after World War II and into the early 60s. Generation X are those who were born between the mid-60s and the early 80s. Those who were born after that are the millennials. Some are also making distinctions between the generations of millennials, and the claim is that it is the younger ones who are really the problem. But we shall treat them as a monolith in this video, since the problems already began with the older ones. The baby boomers were the generation that was born into the Cold War and managed to defeat communism and end it without much bloodshed. They were also the generation that carried out the sexual revolution, and they were the generation that defeated systemic racism, sexism and homophobia. They did it mainly by employing new mediums which they made their own, like rock and roll music, through which you could inject new behaviors, attitudes and ideas into the mainstream. Stand-up comedy, through which you could use subversive humor to attack the norms of everyday life. Science fiction, through which you could imagine alternative worlds. And television, which was a platform to these mediums. They freed speech from the shackles that old ideologies put on it. They opened doors that previously were closed in front of certain identities. They appropriated each other's cultures and brought greater social harmony. They danced away all taboos and freed the body from old inhibitions. They broke the class barriers and made the class war obsolete. And they created great art, which we still enjoy today. When Generation X came along, we were still in these social struggles, but it felt like most of the work had been done, and we were just left with finishing the job. And the mediums were still the same mediums, but their freshness was gone. When I was a teenager, the way to rebel and scream your truth at the world was still by forming a rock and roll band, but it already felt like there's not much left to express in this way. The greatest Generation X rock and roll band, Nirvana, made a career out of singing about how pointless rock and roll is. We were an ironic and cynical generation, with not much to do. What we did have that was ours was the internet, and video games. But in the 80s and 90s these mediums were still in their infancy, and could not be used to do anything significant. When the millennials appeared, it seemed like they would be the generation that will use these mediums to achieve greatness, and take liberal society forward. But, at the moment, it looks like the millennials are taking us backwards. It's like they are fighting for the right to poop the party. Everything that has been achieved in previous generations is being tarnished, and the academies, in particular, are seeing the emergence of a highly neurotic, petulant and narcissistic generation, with anti-liberal, morally bankrupt and culturally ignorant views. What caused this regression? Mainly, I think, the problem is this. Millennials are ignorant of the struggles of the past, unaware of how good they have it and how we got to this point. And because of this ignorance, they are falling prey to radical anti-liberal scholars, who are setting them against liberal culture. And so, the victories of previous generations are being misrepresented, and liberal society is portrayed in a bad light. Let's see how this is done. Let's begin with homophobia, because here it is really palpable. It's pretty amazing, but millennials don't even know what homophobia is. They never experienced living in a homophobic society. Yet, it wasn't long ago that homosexuals were feared and demonized by almost every society on Earth. The baby boomers grew up into extreme homophobia, and had to work their way out of it. They had to liberate themselves from religious traditions that regarded homosexuality as sinful. They had to shell racial theories that regarded gays as a danger to the purity of the race. They had to learn to tell the difference between homosexuality, transgenderism, transvestitism, pedophilia, sadomasochism and more, because they were all bundled together and gave homosexuals the image of degenerate monsters. They had to realize that homosexuality is not a transmitted disease. They had to comprehend that you will not become gay if you tolerate homosexuals. And they had to internalize that gays do not spread diseases. A bit of this mindset was still around when Generation X reached sexual maturity, but we were already sufficiently educated about homosexuality, so it was easy for us to rid ourselves of the last remnants of homophobia. But millennials never experienced it, and so, when they look at the past, they can't understand why gays were oppressed, why they had to hide in the closet. They don't realize that it was a case of irrational prejudices and fear, which enlightenment and rationality had to overcome. And so, it is easy for the anti-liberal scholars to manipulate them into believing that the fault is in the structural problems of the liberal system, and that as long as it is in place, gay people are oppressed. A similar process took place on the issue of racism. The baby boomers were born into a world that still believed that white people are superior, either biologically or culturally. But decades of cultural exchange made us more open to appreciate human diversity, and Generation X was already pretty free of the racism of the past. Our minds were no longer shaped by white supremacist notions, and we could set out to clear our cultures of the remnants of racism that were left. We felt free to discuss the issue openly, to joke about it, to share in each other's worlds. But again, since millennials don't know what systemic racism is and what we had to overcome, they can be manipulated. The anti-liberal voices are attacking the very things that helped us overcome racism, like cultural exchange, candid speech and racial jokes, and portraying them as if they are actually symptoms of racism that is alive and well. And so, non-white kids are made to feel like victims, white kids are made to feel guilty, and they are all neurotic about speech. On campuses, some non-white students have become so neurotic that they are actually self-segregating. Same with the issue of sexism. The baby boomers were born into a world which regarded men and women as different by nature, and therefore destined to do different things in life. The boomers felt like the differences weren't that big, and that this tradition constrains them, so they pushed for a society where every individual can choose their own path. For Generation X, it was already natural to accept that people should not be constrained by traditional gender roles, and we did what we wanted. But anti-liberal scholars have created the patriarchy myth, and exploiting the fact that millennials never experienced systemic sexism, they managed to persuade many of them that they live in a patriarchal society. The difference is this: for us, it is obvious that traditional gender roles have evolved naturally because of our biology. The reason why we don't have to obey them anymore is that modern technology allows us to largely overcome our natural physical traits. But those scholars who push the patriarchy myth tell a different story. They argue that there are no significant biological differences between men and women, and the gender roles are completely a social construct. With the advent of intersectionality, this idea has been expanded to explain other types of historical discriminations as well. For those who believe in this myth, the patriarchy is held together by language and cultural norms, and if only we spoke the correct words and adopted the right behaviors, we would be free of sexism, racism and homophobia, and everyone will be equal. And so, millennials are brought up to be neurotic about words and manners, and self-censorious to an extreme degree. The negative effect this has on art, humor and culture is something that we experience every day. This also ties to the issue of sex. The baby boomers were born into a world that still regarded sex as sinful, as something that should be done for procreation. The sexual revolution had to overcome a lot of inhibitions that were instilled by culture, and learn to regard sex as a natural and fun thing. Actually, there were two sexual revolutions. The sexual revolution of the boomers was done mainly by boys, who liberated themselves. The sexual revolution of Generation X was done by girls, and completed the process of liberation. But in the process, a lot of harm was done as well. Since the sexual taboos were all seen as religious oppression, as something that should be broken, people took liberties with other people's bodies. The idea was that we should liberate each other, push each other over the edge of our inhibitions, and this was often fun, but often enough it could be traumatizing. Today, when there are no inhibitions left, we are dealing with the aftermath. The traumas of the past are brought up, and the liberties that were taken are portrayed as symptoms of the patriarchy. And so, kids are once again brought up to fear sex. Sex is one activity where you learn that it is fun to have someone invade your private space and do things to you. But the anti-liberals are preaching that this invasion is an assault, and they have managed to make many millennials neurotic about the sexual act, and about sexuality in general.
Don't be afraid of your freedom.
All of that makes the millennials susceptible to revolutionary Marxist thought, and to socialist politics. The baby boomers were the generation that overcame communism, and Generation X already grew up cynical about the idea of revolution. We realize that life in a liberal society is good enough, better than anything Marxist utopia could offer. But since many millennials have been convinced that we live in an oppressive society, and that all the problems of the society are a social construct, they are driven to believe in revolutionary ideology, or that we need government programs to reshape our lives.
You've done it all.
But the biggest problem, perhaps, is that millennials are not building a strong individual ego. When our heroes were rock stars and stand-up comedians, our attitude was that you should express yourself, and get the world to accept you as you are. But today's kids are growing with social media, and it seems to cultivate a collective mentality, in which they see themselves in the eyes of others. And with that, they are vulnerable to the manipulation of anti-liberal forces that are twisting their minds into giving up on their individuality while thinking that they are fighting for it. For instance, when they talk about self-definition, they are not talking about behaving how they want, but about how they should be called. In other words, how other people should define them. And this makes their ego very fragile and dependent on others, to the point where they are shouting down speech that threatens their self-perception. Add to that the deficiency in physical types of activity. In the baby boomer period, there was a clear distinction drawn between the jocks and the nerds. The jocks were the ones who played sports and formed rock bands, and they were the ones who were considered cool, whereas the nerds stayed at home, read comic books and did brainy stuff, and were very uncool. For the Fonz, nerd was the opposite of cool. Generation X brought a change, and we learned that there are cool things in nerd culture as well. We still valued physical activity, but we also enjoyed brainy stay-at-home entertainment. Millennial culture is mainly nerd culture, and the lack of physical activity, the kind of activity where you might sometimes get hurt, might be adding to the delicate snowflake mentality that is incapable of handling confrontation. Of course, not all millennials are like that. I am merely characterizing a certain malady that is typical of this generation. The more cynical millennials, along with Gen Xers, were the ones that established the rules of internet culture. It happened mainly on 4chan, where cynicism often turned into out-and-out nihilism. The internet was the Wild West for a while, and you could do whatever you wanted. But then, other types of people started to join in, and the wars began. The first internet war was the 4chan Civil War of 2009, and like every great romantic war, it was about a girl. Except it never really is all about the girl. If you look into it, you realize that the war was about the values of internet culture, what it should stand for. It was the moment when even the cynical betards realized that there are things worth fighting for. If you haven't watched my playlist telling that story, it is time you did so. The second internet war came in 2010, and it was the war between 4chan and Tumblr. This time, it was about something even more important: memes. But, once again, this wasn't really about memes, but about the soul of the internet. Tumblr is where the new anti-liberal ideology found a place to thrive, and where all the neurotic millennial snowflakes could find affirmation to the antisocial behavior. So we had two types of antisocial behavior, that of 4chan and that of Tumblr, and they were diametrically opposed to each other. It's extreme nihilism and anarchism versus extreme petulance and authoritarianism. In 2010 it was disguised as a war about memes, but in 2014, the war revealed its true nature. Gamergate, the third internet war, opened up the struggle which we are still embroiled in today. And here is where the baby boomers have finally lost their cool. Since they don't understand the internet, they completely misjudge what is going on. The Tumblr social justice warriors seem to be standing for the same values that they believe in, so they tend to be on their side, not realizing that they are actually a threat to everything that they fought for. Whereas Chan culture seems to them like a bunch of bomb throwers that are set to destroy liberal values, when in fact it is another manifestation of something that Western culture has seen many times before. A group of creative rebels who seem to be espousing anarchy, but are actually a force that wants to clean up the rot that are set in, and will eventually end up reaffirming liberal values. The boomers are hopelessly out of touch, and with very few exceptions, they are currently a total embarrassment. We see it mainly in how the representatives of the old boomer mediums are behaving. It used to be that rock stars, actors and stand-up comedians were cultural heroes, seen as the representatives of their generation or their identity group. They became stars because of their ability to best express the feelings of those who became their fans. Thus, they were seen as spokespersons, and their opinion mattered. We are no longer in that period, but the musicians, actors and comedians didn't get the memo. They see it as their job to lead the fight against the rising forces of darkness, but since no one really cares what they think anymore, they look totally ridiculous while doing so. This encompasses not just boomers, but entertainers of all ages. They are trapped in the bubble of their mediums, still perceiving themselves as cultural heroes who have the responsibility to fight the power. But the cultural heroes of today come from the internet. The internet does belong to the millennials, and they are the ones who should lead the fight against the anti-liberal forces that are threatening our societies. For that, they will have to maintain the free spirit of Chan culture, but transform its nihilism into positive values. And they will have to maintain the diversity values of Tumblr, but realize that you can't do it by denying and suppressing the inevitable friction between different identities. And this is where Generation X becomes important. Gen Xers still have a healthy ego, an ego that wasn't attacked by the ideology of self-victimization, white and male guilt, collective Munchausen syndrome, narcissistic snowflakery, multiple gender identities, collectivist thought and so forth. They have a life outside of the internet, so they are not consumed by social media but rather treated as an extension of their personality. They are cynical of utopian ideologies and know the value of liberalism. They are comfortable with their sexuality and enjoy desiring and being desired. They are not neurotic about words, and their speech is free. And they regard people by their personal traits, not by the group that they were born into. Thus, they can serve as cool role models, which millennials can imitate to work their way out of what social media and the social justice ideology have done to their minds. And as for you baby boomers, I'm sorry, but something is happening here, and you don't know what it is. So why don't you all fade away, and don't try to dig what we all say. The end must justify the memes, because your generation don't mean a thing to us. So let the internet be, get off of our cloud. It's not your world anymore.